Brought to you by Charity Mobile, the phone company that supports life and family. 5% of your monthly plan price goes to your favorite charity. Mention offer code TRADITION for a special Christmas offer. Learn more at CharityMobile.com.
A story that shockingly went under the radar, even outside the United States during the holiday weekend, was that the Vatican has issued yet another new guideline regarding apparitions and mysticism and the rest of it. A few months ago, the Vatican issued, by Cardinal Fernandez, the writer of impure poetry that should have, under normal circumstances, caused him to be laicized, but instead, he now runs the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. Cardinal Fernandez, a few months ago, issued guidelines about mysticism and Marian apparitions and the rest. The Vatican will never be approving any Marian apparition. The closest that the Vatican will ever do is say, this is not a harm to the faith, and it conforms to the messages here and conform to what the church teaches on certain things, so you are free to study this if you so choose. That is the closest you'll get. The norms specifically say that the Vatican is no longer in the business of declaring something to be of supernatural origin, reserving that to the personal judgment of the Holy Father at any given time. That's a remarkably moderated, lukewarm response to these things compared to how things historically would happen. Even if the Vatican would rarely approve Marian apparitions and the messages of mystics, leaving a sort of first step approval mostly to local ordinaries who would submit something to Rome, and then Rome would rarely, if ever, respond to things. Unfortunately, now it looks like they are never going to say, yes, the alleged apparition of Our Lady at fill-in-the-blank place is actually of supernatural origin, etc. You will never get a message of Fatima kind of approval under the current Vatican. Well, recently, Cardinal Fernandez issued guidelines on false mysticism and essentially spiritual harm being inflicted on people by those who promote erroneous messages. And on the surface, it's a good idea. There should be punishments for people who try to fabricate Marian apparition messages and the rest, but these guidelines can be used as a cudgel to hammer people who actually have legitimate experiences. And you remember that one of the guidelines in the original new norms that the Vatican issued earlier in 2024 is that any message purported to be from Our Lady or any vision from mystics will not be approved if the contents include anything that make it sound like there's something wrong with the church, that sows distrust between the laity and the hierarchy. That immediately eliminates Our Lady of La Salette, Our Lady of the Good Event of the Purification, sometimes more commonly called Our Lady of Good Success for some reason, even though the name doesn't even come close to translating to that, or Our Lady of Akita, as examples. These messages would never be approved under the new norms. And now you could read what is happening here with Fernandez as saying, if you promote such messages, you are guilty of causing spiritual harm. That's a way for them to clamp down on their messaging, to keep the legitimacy of what they're doing irreproachable. These are folks we're talking about here who probably don't believe much in Marian apparitions at all, but they do see some benefit to them. So headline from zenit.org. Vatican institutes task force against spiritual bad things and false mysticism. It is proposed to entrust to the Dicastery for Legislative Text and the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith the task of analyzing whether it is possible to typify a crime of abuse of a spiritual kind in context of false mysticism and to present concrete proposals. On the surface, this is a good thing. There are plenty of people who openly promote condemned mystics who try to grift off apparitions or mystical experiences they've just made up out of thin air, and all of that can lead people astray. Obviously, something should be done about that, but these norms could also be used as a cudgel to suppress inconvenient Marian messages and the messages of inconvenient mystics. Recall that in the original norms that Dicastery under Fernandez published some months ago, one of the leading metrics for determining the validity, or at least the permission for an apparition's message or mystic's visions, was that if the content of such messages caused the laity to distrust the hierarchy or the church, or to promote the infiltration thesis about the state of the church, such messages would be suppressed. This new set of rules would allow the Vatican to formally suppress movements around such messages. As the message of Our Lady of Akita has technically never received formal approval by the Vatican, it received the personal approval of then Cardinal Ratzinger, who said the message of Our Lady of Fatima was functionally identical to that, or in substance, was identical to that of the Third Secret of Fatima. So he gave it his sort of tacit approval, but the Vatican has never formally said yes to it. This isn't exactly comforting news, despite that messages like that have been given a lot of informal approval by popes in the past, or by the assistants to popes like Cardinal Ratzinger at the time in the early 80s when he approved Akita personally. Now, Zenit has the full text of Fernandez's declaration, which is very short, and it follows. Quote, "The term false mysticism appears in the regulations of the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith within a very specific context, namely issues related to spirituality and alleged supernatural phenomenon, which now are handled by the doctrinal section. This includes, quote, problems of behavior connected with the discipline of the faith, such as cases of pseudo-mysticism, alleged apparitions, visions, and messages attributed to supernatural origin. In this context, false mysticism refers to spiritual approaches that harm the harmony of the Catholic understanding of God and our relationship with the Lord. It is in this sense that the phrase appears in the Magisterium. For example, in the encyclical Horatius Aquas, Pope Pius XII rejects as false mysticism the conception of God present in Jansenist groups, which do not account for the mystery of the incarnation of their spirituality. Quoting Pope Pius XII, "It is wrong, therefore, to assert that the contemplation of the physical heart of Jesus prevents an approach to a close love of God and holds back the soul on the way to the attainment of the highest virtues. This false mystical doctrine the Church emphatically rejects, as, speaking through our predecessor of happy memory, Innocent XI, she rejected the errors of those who foolishly declared, quote, souls of this interior way ought not to make acts of love for the Blessed Virgin, the saints, or the humanity of Christ, for love directed towards those is of the senses, since its objects are also of that kind. No creature, neither the Blessed Virgin nor the saints, ought to have a place in our heart, because God alone wishes to occupy it and possess it." As an aside, that quote from Innocent XI is rejecting the notion that you can't give due honor to the Blessed Virgin or the saints because it takes from Christ. Okay, just to be clear. Continuing. There is no delect in canon law classified by the name false mysticism, even though canonists occasionally use the expression in a manner that is closely tied to offenses of the misuse of this kind of thing. However, in the new norms for proceeding the discernment of alleged supernatural phenomenon, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith specified that, quote, the use of purported supernatural experiences or recognized mystical elements as a means of or a pretext for exerting control over people or carrying out gross offenses is to be considered of particular moral gravity. This consideration allows the situation described here to be elevated as an aggravating circumstance if it occurs together with delicts. At the same time, it is possible to classify a delict of spiritual offense, avoiding the overly broad and ambiguous expression of false mysticism. It is proposed to entrust to the Dicastery for Legislative Texts and the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith the task of analyzing this possibility and presenting concrete proposals, forming a working group between them, chaired by the Prefect for the Dicastery for Legislative Texts. Signed, Victor Manuel Cardinal Fernandez, Prefect, signed by Francis on the 22nd of November. You see how that can end up being something to be concerned about. Yes, there are plenty of people who promote false mystics. I mean, I get messages from people all the time saying, Anthony, you really need to cover this alleged Marian apparition. Just ignore the fact that every bishop involved with it has said no to it, and that the people who promoted it originally were obviously con artists. Doesn't matter. You should promote it. No. There's need to suppress manufactured Marian apparitions, ones that are fake. It wouldn't be that hard to fake one. Fortunately, these rules can also be used as a cudgel to hammer down those Marian apparitions which may actually be authentic, those that have messages warning about the state of the church. I've done videos before synthesizing Marian apparition messages, and all the major ones, Our Lady of the Good Event of the Purification, miscalled Our Lady of Good Success for some reason, La Salette, Akita, Fatima, and a few others. When you put their messages together, it becomes pretty obvious that they're talking about a crisis in the church that is essentially an apostasy, characterized by priests and bishops being in love with worldly things and sins of the flesh, leading to essentially an apostasy led from the very top of the church by the actual reigning pontiff. I think it was pretty obvious that that's the warning, and that is what we've been living through for decades now. And unfortunately, instead of the Vatican doing what would be the logical thing to do, which is to fix the problem, the Vatican has decided instead that their best bet is to clamp down on any future messages. And this new set of guidelines will be an effective tool for that purpose. Let me know what you think of this in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't, it does help. So to sharing this on social media, that helps enormously too. And if you appreciate the work of Return to Tradition, the work we do here, if you've ever thought about supporting the work of Return to Tradition, you can do so through the link in the description box below to Patreon, Subscribestar, or hitting that join button. Any option like that helps keep these daily messages coming and is greatly appreciated. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.